Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Before we get into today's video, I just wanted to say thank you for the incredible support you showed on the new channel. You guys are amazing. I also noticed that some people had trouble finding it, so from now on, I'll always leave the link at the very top of the video description, and possibly in the comments as well. Now, talking about today's video, we're diving into two longer stories that I've actually been wanting to share on the channel for quite some time. Both are genuinely unsettling, but I have to say the first one really got to me. It gave me real chills the first time I read it, and even again while I was editing the video. I hope you feel the same way I did, and as always, let me know what you think in the comments. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Me and my wife have always been pretty adventurous people. We love hiking, climbing, spending time in the mountains, and over the years we've invested in quite a bit of gear to keep ourselves safe whenever we go camping. Anyone who has camped in remote places knows that when you're sleeping in a tent, you're basically protected by nothing more than a thin layer of fabric. And whatever is out there, whether it's animals or people, is only a few feet away. And honestly, believe me when I say that people are usually a lot scarier than animals. Over the years, the two of us have had a few encounters that were, let's just say, a little messed up. Strange hikers, people behaving oddly out in the woods, things that made us pack up and leave a place earlier than we planned. But even with all of that, nothing we had experienced before was anything like what happened during the trip I'm about to tell you about. Even now, it still disturbs me, mostly because of how surreal and different it was from anything I had ever heard about before. And it was probably because the person who tormented us was pretty messed up. A total lunatic. And it's honestly scary to think someone can go that far. A while back, we decided to spend a week in a part of the Appalachian Mountains on the Pennsylvania side, an area where we had already camped a few times in the past. It's not a very well-known location, and for that reason I'm not going to mention the exact place, because I don't want it to suddenly turn into some kind of weird tourist attraction because of what happened. That sort of thing happens sometimes, and I'd rather avoid it, especially since there's a very small village not too far from there, and if that place suddenly filled up with curious people, it would probably lose all of its charm. So the area was fairly isolated, although not completely cut off from civilization. If you walked for about an hour along one of the trails, you could reach that little village, but other than that, there really wasn't much going on around there. Instead of camping this time, we decided to rent a cabin. It was actually the same cabin we had stayed in the year before. We had liked it a lot. The owner had been very friendly, and when we contacted him again, he even gave us a small discount since we were coming back for a second stay. Everything felt perfect. It was a place we already knew, and we sometimes joked that it was almost like our little home during that time of the year, because the previous year we had visited during the exact same week. It was early March, which is honestly a beautiful time to be in the mountains. The air is still a little cold, and the ground is still damp from winter, but you can already see the forest starting to turn green again as spring slowly pushes through. If you don't mind a bit of rain during your hikes, it's actually a great time to travel because prices are cheaper and the trails are much quieter. So we arrived at the cabin excited and in a great mood. The place had 2 floors. The downstairs was mostly open, with a small living room area, a kitchen, and then at the back there was a little storage room with a door where the owner kept cleaning supplies, an extra sleeping bag, and a few random things. Upstairs, there was a fairly large bathroom, a comfortable bedroom, and then a very small second room next to it. That room had a small bed, so it could work as a kid's bedroom. But since we don't have children, we usually just used it to store our gear and backpacks. When we got there, we unloaded everything, settled in, and started organizing the place. We always bring some protective gear when we go on trips like this, although we didn't bring all the equipment we normally use when we're camping, like motion sensors and a small perimeter alarm that alerts us if someone approaches the campsite. Those are things we usually rely on when we're sleeping in a tent in the middle of nowhere, because personal safety is extremely important when you're in remote areas, and we've learned not to assume that bad things only happen to other people. But in a cabin, you naturally feel a little more comfortable, a little more protected. Everything was going smoothly, just like it had the year before. On the first day, we unpacked all the food and organized it in the kitchen, dividing everything by meals for the 7 days we were planning to stay there. We're big fans of meal prep, especially on trips like this, because it means we don't have to worry about cooking complicated meals and can focus on enjoying the hikes instead. So, on that first afternoon, we prepared everything for the whole week, stacked the firewood neatly inside the cabin, and basically got the place ready for the days ahead. Even though daytime temperatures were comfortable enough, nights in the mountains are always colder, and there's something really nice about sitting in a warm room with the fireplace going after a long hike. That night we went to bed early, and the next morning we woke up feeling completely refreshed and ready for our first hike. But it was during that very first climb that I started feeling a slight sense of discomfort. Now, I'm not the kind of person who jumps to conclusions or thinks everything is some kind of conspiracy. I'm confident in my ability to handle myself in the mountains. I know what I'm doing out there, and I don't usually let my imagination run wild. In fact, I'm normally the type of person who rolls his eyes when someone says they feel like they're being watched. But that day, that was exactly the feeling I had. It was subtle at first. Just this strange impression that we weren't completely alone. Like there was someone else somewhere in the forest around us, just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe another hiker somewhere on a nearby trail. Then at one point my wife looked at me and said she felt the same thing. She said she had the weird sensation that someone was watching us, and that the whole area suddenly felt bad. We finished the hike anyway, but the entire way back to the cabin, we both had that same uneasy feeling, like something wasn't quite right. The strange part was that we hadn't seen anyone the entire day. Not a single hiker, not even distant voices on the trails. And yet we both had this strong impression that we hadn't been alone out there. Eventually we got back to the cabin, made dinner, and lit the fireplace. After spending the whole day hiking, we were both pretty tired, and the warmth of the room made it even easier to relax. We put on a movie, sat on the couch together, and at some point we both ended up falling asleep without even realizing it. But later that night, I suddenly woke up. The movie was still playing quietly on the television, and the room was lit by that soft, flickering light from the screen and the dying fire in the fireplace. I checked the clock, and it was around 1 in the morning. I woke up with the feeling that I had heard a loud laugh. I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you honestly, that's what it sounded like. A frantic laugh. I looked over at my wife, because that was the most logical explanation. But she was still asleep on the couch beside me, with the blanket half pulled over her shoulders, breathing slowly, and not reacting to anything. So whatever I had heard hadn't come from her. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to figure out if maybe it had come from the TV instead, because the movie was still playing quietly in the background. But when I paid attention to it for a few seconds, I realized the scene on screen was completely quiet. Just two characters walking through some hallway. and there hadn't been any laughter in it. Normally, I'm the kind of person who immediately tries to find the rational explanation for things like that, especially when you're half asleep, because your brain does weird things when you wake up suddenly. So at first I honestly assumed I must have dreamed it, or maybe heard something outside and my brain just filled in the rest. Looking back now, that moment right there was probably the first in a long chain of decisions that I honestly shouldn't have made. It's strange to admit it, because I like to think of myself as someone fairly cautious when it comes to being in remote places. But that night I did a few things that were just stupid. Completely unnecessary risks. And the worst part is that I didn't just put myself in danger. I also put my wife in that situation. At first, I simply got up from the couch to walk into the kitchen and grab a glass of water. Mostly to wake myself up properly and shake off that weird feeling of having just heard something that didn't make sense. But that's when I heard another sound. It was faint at first, and I couldn't really place it. It had this metallic quality to it, like metal slowly scraping or rubbing against metal. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. And the more I listened, the more it seemed like it was coming from somewhere outside the front. So, I walked toward the living room window as quietly as I could. The cabin had those wooden shutters on the inside, and I slowly pushed one of them open just enough to look through the glass and see if I could spot anything outside. But there was nothing. Just darkness, trees, and the faint outline of the forest beyond the small clearing around the cabin. The sound continued though, slow and rhythmic. Curious, I unlocked the window and pushed it open slightly, just enough that the sound became clearer. And that's when it clicked. It sounded exactly like a swing. Not the clean sound of a new one, but the creaking metal of an old playground swing. The kind you'd hear in a schoolyard where the chains have started rusting and every movement produces that long, tired squeal of metal grinding against metal. It was such a bizarre thing to hear out there that for a few seconds I just stood there, trying to process it. A swing in the middle of the woods, at 1 in the morning. And that's when I made the decision I mentioned earlier, the irrational one. Instead of closing the window and forgetting about it, instead of waking my wife or just locking the doors and staying inside like any normal person would probably do, I grabbed the keys from the small table near the door and quietly stepped outside. My wife was still asleep on the couch, and she's always been a very heavy sleeper, so I didn't expect the door opening to wake her. I told myself I was just going to take a quick look. That was it. The cold night air hit me the moment I stepped outside, and the sound of the swing immediately became clearer. It was definitely coming from somewhere just beyond the trees in front of the cabin. So I started walking toward it. Slowly at first, trying not to make too much noise on the gravel and damp ground around the clearing. And that's when I started hearing something else mixed in with the creaking. Every now and then, between the slow movements of the swing, there was a quiet little laugh. Not the loud, frantic laugh I had heard earlier. This one was softer, almost like someone quietly chuckling to themselves. It was unmistakably an adult voice, but there was something about the way it sounded that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't a normal laugh. It sounded strange somehow, like someone enjoying something in a very private, unsettling way. That was the moment I really started feeling scared, because suddenly none of it made sense anymore. We were deep in the forest, miles away from anything resembling a playground or a park. And yet there I was, standing in the dark, listening to a rusty swing creaking back and forth, while someone out there laughed softly to themselves. It was completely out of place, completely surreal. And then I saw him. Even now, when I think back on that moment, it still feels like something out of a nightmare. Hanging from one of the larger branches of a tree about 20 yards away was a swing that had clearly been put together by hand. Just a wooden plank tied with chains over the branch. And sitting on it, slowly rocking back and forth in the moonlight, was a grown man dressed as a clown. He was just swinging there, pushing lightly with his feet every few seconds, his head tilted slightly forward as if he was watching the ground while quietly laughing to himself. It looked less like a real situation and more like something out of a horror movie. Or maybe something you'd see in a psychiatric hospital if someone had escaped and wandered into the woods. For a second, I honestly couldn't even process what I was looking at. My brain just refused to accept that what I was seeing was real. I had already started turning around to head back toward the cabin when the swing suddenly stopped moving. The man lifted his head slowly and looked directly at me. Even from that distance, I could see the white makeup on his face and the exaggerated smile painted across it. Then he said one word, just a casual little greeting. But the way he said it sent a chill straight through me. Every instinct in my body suddenly kicked in at once, and I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard the chains of the swing rattle as he jumped off it, and a second later, I could hear him running too. That was the moment pure panic set in. I started shouting for my wife as loud as I possibly could while sprinting back toward the cabin, yelling for her to open the door even though part of me was convinced she wouldn't hear me. Like I said, she sleeps deeply, and normally something like that wouldn't wake her. But I must have been screaming at the top of my lungs, because just as I reached the porch, the front door suddenly flew open. My wife was standing there, completely confused and terrified, asking what the hell was going on. I barely managed to get inside before slamming the door shut behind me. Almost immediately, there was a heavy impact against the other side of it. It sounded like someone had just thrown their entire body against the door. My wife was now yelling too, asking what was happening, and I was trying to explain between breaths that there was a clown outside, which even as I said it out loud, sounded completely insane. Then we heard a tapping sound at the window, and we both turned toward it at the same time. He was standing right there, his hand pressed flat against the glass, tapping slowly, while he stared at us through the window I had opened earlier. And he was smiling, just standing there in the darkness outside the cabin, smiling straight at us. Luckily, I had closed the window before stepping outside earlier. Otherwise, he would have had direct access to the room. I didn't waste time thinking after that. I grabbed the handgun we had brought with us and aimed it toward the window, shouting that I had no problem using it if he didn't leave us alone. For a few seconds, he didn't move. He just stood there staring. That was when my wife completely snapped. Before I even realized what she was doing, she grabbed the gun from my hands, aimed it slightly away from the window, and fired a shot into the wooden wall near it. The sound of the gunshot inside the cabin was deafening. She shouted that if he didn't leave immediately, the next one would be aimed directly at him. For the first time since we had seen him, the clown actually reacted. He slowly turned his head toward her, and the smile on his face somehow got worse. It's hard to describe it, but there was something about the look he gave her that felt completely psychopathic. Not anger, not fear. Just this cold, amused expression that made my stomach drop. Then he turned around and walked back into the forest. Just like that. We immediately closed the shutters over the window and locked everything in the cabin. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, as soon as there was enough daylight to see properly, we ran straight to the car and drove out of there as fast as we could. Of course, we reported everything. The police eventually found the swing hanging from that tree, exactly where we had described it. It had clearly been built by someone and left there intentionally. Because of the gunshot, we ended up having to pay for the damage to the cabin wall. Although the owner was surprisingly understanding and actually covered part of the repair costs himself once he heard what had happened. I think he felt genuinely bad that something like that had happened on his property. He wasn't the one who built the swing. In fact, even though it was fairly close to the cabin, it wasn't close enough that it would make sense for something like that to be there for a kid to use while their parents watched from the house. And the truth is, he had no idea that swing was even there. As far as we know, there haven't been any other incidents reported there since. But no one ever figured out who that clown was, why he was out there in the middle of the night, or whether he even knew we were staying in that cabin before he saw me step outside. Maybe he just wanted to scare someone. Maybe he was completely insane. All I know is that the way he slammed into that door showed he could run incredibly fast. And the way he looked at my wife when she threatened him is something I'll probably never forget. We haven't gone back to the forest since. Not after a night like that. I think some experiences just stay with you forever. What I'm about to tell you happened fairly recently, but if I start where it actually happened, none of it will make sense. To understand why I reacted the way I did, why I didn't just brush things off, you need to know where I come from, and who we were before life pulled us in different directions. I grew up in a small town tucked deep into the Great Smoky Mountains, part of the wider Appalachian Range. 37 years ago, that place felt even smaller than it probably was. News didn't travel fast. Trends didn't reach us until years later, if they reached us at all. Everyone knew everyone. Not in the polite, wave from the porch way. Really knew them. Their parents, their grandparents, their business. There were 6 of us who were inseparable. 6 kids who grew up more like siblings than friends. We spent our days running through the woods, building half-collapsed forts, daring each other to knock on doors and sprint away before someone answered. We worked too. That was just part of it. Helping with repairs, hauling wood, picking up odd jobs whenever someone needed an extra pair of hands. Times weren't easy, but we didn't feel deprived. We had freedom. The kind you don't really see anymore. We disappeared into the mountains at sunrise and came back when the sky turned orange, and nobody panicked. Eventually, though, life did what it always does. Some of us left for college. Some went straight into work. We all followed different paths, and without any big fight or dramatic fallout, we drifted. For 7 years, the 6 of us were never in the same place at the same time. We'd message occasionally. One of us would be in town and meet up with another for coffee. But the group, the original 6, never reunited. Until last year. One of the pillars of our community passed away. An older man who had been there for all of us, in different ways. He'd helped our families when money was tight. He showed up to school events, fixed broken fences, gave advice whether you asked for it or not. His funeral brought the whole town together, and it brought us back. We all planned to stay about a week. At first, it was just about paying our respects. Then it became coffee meetups, late-night conversations, catching up on who we'd become. 7 years is a long time. We weren't kids anymore. We had jobs, responsibilities, and more baggage. It was during one of those afternoons that Michael suggested we do something we used to do all the time. Camp in the Smokies. I'll call him Michael, even though that's not his real name. Michael had always made me slightly uncomfortable. Even as a kid, there was something about him that felt off. He could be charming when he wanted to be, funny and magnetic even. But there were moments, small, sharp ones, where he'd say something unnecessarily cruel. Or he'd disappear for hours, and come back with a look on his face like he knew something the rest of us didn't. As kids, I ignored it. We all did. When you grow up together, you don't want to believe one of your own might not be who you think they are. Still, when he suggested a trip, no one objected. Back then, we used to camp with barely any gear. Cheap tents, thin sleeping bags, sometimes not enough food. Now, we were adults. We had steady incomes. So instead of roughing it, we decided to rent a cabin. Michael offered to handle the booking. That probably should have been my first hesitation. But the cabin he found was surprisingly cheap, almost suspiciously so. I remember thinking we'd show up to something falling apart. No running water, no heat. But when we arrived, it was the opposite. It was beautiful and cozy. Recently renovated by the look of it. The wood smelled fresh. The furniture wasn't worn down. It didn't feel abandoned or neglected. It felt lived in. Either it was rented often, or someone used it regularly. The first day went perfectly. We unpacked, laughed about old stories, grilled food outside while the sun dipped behind the trees. And for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. Like we were just older versions of the same 6 kids. But that night, sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up. I've always had a light sleep. Insomnia has been part of my life for as long as I can remember. So when I heard footsteps on the stairs, it pulled me right out of whatever shallow sleep I'd managed to get. Slow, careful steps. Someone heading downstairs. I didn't think much of it. One of the guys probably needed water, or couldn't sleep. So I turned over and tried to ignore it. Then I heard what sounded like the front door. Not just the handle, but the door itself. Like a faint shift of air, and the soft thud of it closing. I remember lying there, half awake, debating whether I'd imagined it. I didn't want to be up all night, stuck in that restless spiral I know too well. So I forced myself to relax, and eventually, I drifted off. The next day, during a hike, I casually mentioned it. Said I thought I'd heard someone go downstairs, maybe even step outside. They all looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Every single one of them said they'd slept straight through the night. No one got up. No one went downstairs. No one opened the door. And I knew, absolutely knew, I hadn't dreamed the footsteps. The sound of someone opening the door I could maybe question. But the footsteps, that had been real. Still, I let it go. What was the alternative? That someone was lying for no reason? It didn't make sense. So I dropped it. But that night, it happened again. This time it was closer to 3 in the morning. The same slow steps, the same careful descent. Only now, I was fully awake. Instead of staying in bed, I got up quietly. I cracked my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, careful not to make the floorboards creak. From where I stood, I could see down toward the staircase that led to the main floor. I watched Michael walk down, with no hesitation and no confusion, like he knew exactly where he was going. I stayed hidden and moved closer to a window that overlooked the front of the cabin. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want him to see me watching. He opened the front door and stepped outside. For a second, I wondered if maybe he had insomnia too. Maybe he just needed air, needed space. So I tried to rationalize it. That's what we do when something feels wrong. We search for the most normal explanation. From the shadow of the window, I watched him circle the cabin slowly. Then he kept walking past the edge of the yard, straight into the trees. I'll admit it. Watching him disappear into the trees like that made me genuinely uncomfortable. Not just because of the folklore that hangs over the Smokies, the old stories about people wandering off at night and coming back different, but because he had done the exact same thing the night before, and then flat out denied it. My mind was already running at full speed. There was no way I was going back to sleep. So I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for him to return. But he didn't come back until 5:30 in the morning, and that's over 2 hours. 2 full hours out there in the woods in the middle of the night. When I heard the door open again, I didn't think. I just moved. I got up, rubbed my eyes, and walked out of my room as if I'd just woken up. I caught him stepping inside. I asked if he'd been up long. He said no, said he'd just woken up too, that he'd stepped outside for some air. I just smiled and nodded, pretended to focus on making coffee. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't even the fact that he'd gone out. People take late walks. People can't sleep. That's normal. What wasn't normal was lying about something that harmless. The ease of it. The calmness. It made my skin crawl. All day I debated what to do. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I'd always been a little too sensitive when it came to him. Maybe this was confirmation bias. I expected something off, so I was finding it. I tried to convince myself of 2 possibilities. Either something was happening and he had a reason not to share it, or this was just his business and I needed to let it go. But that night, it happened again. This time I didn't hesitate. The moment he stepped outside, I followed. I kept my distance. I've always been good at going unnoticed. Even as a kid, I was the quiet one, the observer. So I moved carefully, just enough to keep track of him without giving myself away. We didn't walk far, 15 minutes at most. Then I saw him step into a hunter's cabin. I don't know what I had expected. Honestly, I think my mind had been cycling through a dozen scenarios. None of them ended with him calmly entering a structure in the woods at 3 in the morning. I stood there for a moment, watching. But then, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I turned around and went back. On the way back, and as I walked into the cabin, I felt awful. Not just tired, but drained, like something had been siphoned out of me. I blamed the lack of sleep, the hiking, the drinking. So I just went back to bed, and didn't wake up until after 1 in the afternoon, when someone knocked on my door asking if I planned on joining the living. I dragged myself out of bed with a lot of effort and stumbled out of the room, still dizzy. When I went downstairs, I noticed something strange. We all looked tired. Not normal tired, but we all looked slightly yellowish, and the only one who actually seemed healthy was Michael. One of the guys, John, ended up throwing up. We had a hike planned, but suddenly nobody seemed too eager. Still, we didn't want to waste the day sitting inside. That's what we'd come here for. Fresh air and time together. That's when I made a decision. I was going to create an opportunity in that moment. I suggested we take a shorter hike. Said there was a nearby route I wanted to try. Obviously, that was a lie. There wasn't an official trail there, but it would take us right past the hunter's cabin. When Michael heard where I wanted to go, he immediately said there was no trail there. I insisted that I was pretty sure there was, so I pushed harder than I normally would have. I told myself it was casual curiosity, but if I'm being honest, I was already obsessed. I needed to see how he'd react. We walked out together. I lagged behind the group because I genuinely felt sick. As we approached the area near the cabin, we veered slightly off so it wouldn't look too obvious. That's when Michael slowed down and matched my pace. He told me he knew exactly what I was doing. He made it clear that if I cared about the well-being of the group, I should drop it, leave him alone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It sounded like a threat. In that moment, I knew he suspected I'd followed him. And that terrified me more than anything else. Because now it wasn't just curiosity. Now it was something he felt protective over. We went back to the cabin early. Everyone felt worse as the day went on. That night, I actually slept. Mostly because my body didn't give me a choice. But the next morning, it was obvious we were sick. All of us looked more yellow, sweaty, and weak. Even Michael claimed to feel symptoms, though he didn't look nearly as bad as the rest of us. He was steady on his feet and alert. He insisted it was probably something we'd eaten. Encouraged us to stay the rest of the week. But the more he pushed for that, the more something inside me screamed that we needed to leave. I didn't want to accuse him. Group dynamics are fragile. One wrong word, and everything fractures. So I kept it neutral. Suggested that maybe it was food poisoning, and that the smart thing would be to head back and at least get checked out. But the second I mentioned the hospital, he pushed back. And right then, John nearly collapsed. Fortunately, that settled it. We packed up, despite Michael's visible frustration, and drove back. We took John straight to the hospital. His tests came back, showing signs of poisoning. Not mild food poisoning. Something chemical. Something that shouldn't have been in his system. That's when the rest of us decided to get tested too. Every single one of us had traces of poison in our bodies. But the thing is, we didn't compare paperwork. We didn't hold the results up side by side. We just believed each other when we said the same thing. The doctors had found something that didn't belong there. And suddenly, those late-night walks into the woods didn't feel mysterious anymore. They felt deliberate. Ever since that week, I haven't been able to shake the way Michael looked at me in the hospital waiting room. While the rest of the guys were distracted, talking to nurses or scrolling through their phones, I kept catching him staring, not confused, not worried, just watching me. There was something openly hostile in it, like he knew I had figured out more than I was supposed to. Over the past year, I've replayed everything more times than I can count. The late-night walks, the hunter's cabin, the way we all got sick except him, the way he pushed so hard for us to stay, the way he immediately resisted the hospital. None of it feels accidental, and I don't believe for a second it was some kind of twisted joke. You don't casually poison 5 people as a prank. Whatever he was doing out there, whatever was in that cabin, I'm convinced we interrupted something. I've gone back and forth about what to do. For months, I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe it really was contaminated food. But the more distance I've had from it, the clearer it feels. There are too many coincidences stacked on top of each other. The part that's been eating at me is the silence. It's been a year, and I haven't said anything beyond that hospital visit. None of us filed a report. None of us questioned the cabin. We just went back to our separate lives, scattered across different states, back to jobs and routines and normality. On paper, it looks like an unfortunate trip where we got sick, but I don't think that's what it was. And lately the guilt has been getting heavier. Because if I'm right, then staying quiet doesn't just protect the group's peace. It protects him. It gives him space to do it again. Maybe not to us. Maybe to someone else who rents that same cabin. Someone who doesn't catch on. Someone who doesn't make it to a hospital in time. The worst case scenario for me speaking up is that I fracture whatever remains of that old friendship. But the truth is, that bond barely exists anymore. We don't live in the Smokies. We don't see each other regularly. The nostalgia of childhood is not a good enough reason to ignore something potentially criminal. I've thought about calling each of them individually, telling them plainly that I don't think what happened was accidental. Asking them to look back at the timeline, at Michael's behavior, at the way he reacted when the hospital was mentioned. I've also thought about going straight to the police and filing a report, even if it's late. Telling them about the cabin, about the poisoning results. Letting them decide whether it's worth investigating him or that property. Because here's the thing. If I stay quiet and something worse happens down the line, I'll carry that too. So, I guess this is my first step. Saying it out loud. Putting it into words instead of keeping it locked in my head. Admitting that I don't think we were just unlucky. I think something happened up there. Something deliberate. And I think I've been afraid to face what that means. The next step is harder. But I already know what it has to be.